All right, so on page 25 of your 1A packet, you see this note here. I equals the square root of -1. My pen is running out. So I equals the square root of -1. I squared equals -1. I cubed equals -I, and I to the fourth equals 1. Now this is an extremely complex topic, but we refer to it as the cycle of I. So I'm going to develop this further on a separate piece of paper, and I would recommend you doing the same along with me. So I am starting by definition with the fact that I equals the square root of -1. This is a known fact. I don't ever write anything as square root of -1, but I refer back to this in order to develop the cycle of I. So I is just going to always be written as I, but for the sake of this, I'm going to say it equals square root of -1. If I think of I squared, what I'm really doing is I'm doing the square root of -1 squared. And if you think back to inverse operations, the square root is opposite of squared. So this is just equal to -1. So now I know I squared equals -1. That's part of that note on that last page. So now I'm going to think, okay, what does I cubed equal? Now think exponent rules. I cubed is equal to I squared times I, right? Because 2 plus 1 is 3. So now I squared, I just said, was equal to -1 times I. So I cubed equals -I. Now I'm going to I to the fourth. And I to the fourth is equal to I squared times I squared. Exponent rules say add the exponents. So 2 plus 2 is 4. I squared is equal to -1, and so is I squared. So that's really just -1 times -1. Negative times a negative is a positive. That's equal to 1. So this is the first cycle. Now I'm going to go through and do the next cycle. So I to the fifth is equal to I to the fourth times I. I to the fourth was equal to 1 times I, so it's just I. So now I'm at the point where I see I to the fifth equals I. I to the sixth is equal to I to the fourth times I squared. I to the fourth is 1. I squared is -1. So that's equal to -1. Now I'm on I to the seventh, which equals I to the fourth times I to the third. 4 plus 3 is 7. I to the fourth is 1. I to the third is -I. 1 times -I is -I. And lastly, I to the eighth is I to the fourth times I to the fourth. And that equals 1 times 1, which is equal to 1. Notice the cycle. I, -1, -I, 1. So every 4 values of the exponent goes I, -1, -I, 1. So I'm going to go back and do this again with the next cycle. So if I've got I to the ninth, that's equal to I to the eighth times I, which is 1 times I, which is I to the 10th is equal to I to the 8th times I squared, which is 1 times negative 1, which is negative 1. Every single thing I'm doing is referring back to this first cycle, but also jumping off of the last term in the cycle. I developed all of this solely through the idea that I equals the square root of negative 1. And then I used exponent rules to develop the rest. So here I to the 11th would equal I to the 8th times I to the 3rd, which is 1 times negative I, which is negative I. And I to the 12th is another cycle of 4, I to the 8th times I to the 4th, which equals 1 times 1, which is 1. So essentially what I like to do is come up with strategies to remember this cycle, because eventually, if you look at your next page, you're going to be simplifying, not the very next page, but page 28, you'll be simplifying exponent powers of I. So I'm just going to do one example here. I like to do these in different ways. I'll show you a few ways. Let's say I to the 27th. So one way you can do this is to divide the power by 4 to see where it falls within a cycle. So the closest value to 4 would be I to the 24th times I to the 3rd. I could do that also by dividing, so 27 divided by 4, and I get 6.75. So I know 4 times 6 gives me 24, and then I have 3 left over because of the 0.75. So I to the 24th is just 1, and I to the 3rd is negative I. So that tells me that I to the 27th equals negative I. Let's try a different one. I to the, 58th. So I to the 58th. I need to find my power of 4. So let's say 58 divided by 4, and I get 14.5. So I know that 4 times 14 will get me really close, 56. So I have I to the 56, and there's 2 left over, so I need times I squared. So I to the 56 is equal to 1, I squared is equal to negative 1, so I to the 58th equals negative 1. So this is just an introduction into the powers of I. This is a challenging topic, but you start to come up with strategies that work for you. So I hope this was helpful, and I hope you get more out of it in class.